and to know more about the military aid and support to Ukraine, especially from the United States. Joining us with us to discuss is VOA correspondent Jessica Stone. Hi, Jessica. Thank you so much for joining us.
Welcome back to the program, Jessica.
Good evening. Good to be with you.
Okay, Jessica. So as we know, Zelensky is continuously asking for help in the form of military aid. He's also asking for a no-fly zone in Ukraine. Now, just talk to us about some of the support that the U.S. is willing to give Zelensky. And if I'm not wrong, U.S. President Joe Biden has earmarked an additional $800 million in military equipment to Ukraine. Can you just talk to us about what Ukraine will be getting from the United States?
Yeah, absolutely. You heard Catherine Gibson's report, $13.5 billion in aid. Most of that is humanitarian aid. About $800 million, as you say, is military aid, and it's going to include 800 anti-aircraft systems, 9,000 anti-armor systems, 7,000 small arms like shotguns and grenade launchers, as well as drones and other military equipment. But Biden is really trying to thread a needle here because there is great concern in Washington, as in many capitals around the world, that this war could escalate at the drop of a hat, so to speak, meaning that the NATO countries, the United States, Europe, they don't want to give Putin a pretext to escalate this war, to make European or NATO-protected cities, military bases into targets, not to mention bringing a nuclear war possibility onto the United States or any other part of the world, as the United Nations General Secretary warned earlier this week. So the stakes are very high. And we really, I think, saw in that video that Zelensky showed that we're sort of returning to a kind of Cold War setup here, where we have autocrats and we have Democrats, and he literally asked President Biden to be the president of peace. So once again, we have a president of a smaller country asking the United States to be the world's policeman. And that is something we haven't heard in 20 or 30 years. Because remember, Putin has chemical weapons, he has biological weapons, and he has nuclear weapons. So the response from Washington has to take that into account. And again, the White House not looking to give him a pretext for war. At the same time, the American people, as was the U.S. Congress, very much moved by the situation. Our social media, as I'm sure yours is very full of support for the Ukrainian people. We just lost some journalists in the last couple of days because there are civilian targets over and above happening in this war. I mean, it's clear that there are targets on children and targets on civilians with the bombing of a shelter that was marked as such just in the last 24 hours. And the polls do tell us that Americans do support a no-fly zone overwhelmingly, but then the details get a bit murky as to how far they're willing to go when they understand that that has to be guaranteed by American and NATO planes. One thing we haven't heard President Biden to commit to at this point, though, is putting the Polish Russian-made MiGs into the hands of the Ukrainians. There's been this proposal by Poland that it would sort of move some of its aircraft into Ukraine to help provide a no-fly zone and then be backstopped by American aircraft, or at least American paid-for aircraft. We haven't seen Biden sign off on that. And again, we are seeing an escalation of action around the world, but it's very careful. This is a very different calculus for much of the world. And there are bombings going on very close to the Polish border. NATO very concerned that it could be drawn into a major war here.
As you mentioned before, Jessica, the U.S. president is threading a needle, so to speak, being very careful about the step that he's taking. The stakes are high. Nobody wants the next world war. Now, on the other hand, the U.S. has also warned China, known to be one of Moscow's longest ally, against providing military aid or sanctions relief to Russia. Now, what can you tell us about this interaction specifically, and what type of relationship are we seeing between Beijing and Moscow here in the context of the war going on today?
Well, clearly you remember the meeting between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping just ahead of the Olympics. And they established a stronger partnership during that meeting and made that very public. And so there's great concern in Washington that that will result in Moscow receiving help economically from China. And we also are having reports that that Russia has asked for military aid. So on Monday, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan went to Rome, met face to face for 7 hours with Yang Jiechi, the chief diplomat and a high-ranking party official in China. He warned China, very frankly, we hear from reporting, that they should not intervene. China continues to not join the Russian oil sanctions. The U.S. would like them to join them so they can become stronger. China, of course, is Russia's largest trading partner. It's also China's largest provider of foreign reserves, and that gives it the ability to cushion the impact that has been happening on the ruble and the value of the ruble from these sanctions. It is worth just fractional amounts of what it used to be worth prior to these sanctions. And the U.S. would certainly like China's help in keeping it at that level to provide pressure to the oligarchs and to Vladimir Putin himself. In the meantime, the White House is also weighing additional sanctions on China for not following some of these global sanctions, these secondary sanctions, we would call them. And the point of view from Washington, basically, China does not represent, according to the White House press secretary, as much of the global economy as the G20 does, or the G7 does, I should say. She says that China represents about 15 to 20% of the global economy. The G7 represents 50%. And so that gives the G7 countries the ability to coordinate and to put more pressure on Moscow. So we don't know exactly what shape those tools will take, but the White House says they still have further tools in the toolbox in order to engage not only Europe and the G7 partners, but the Indo-Pacific in providing pressure on Beijing not to help Moscow. We also have some analysts telling VOA in some of our interviews that financial services and perhaps munitions help may continue, but that at the same time they believe that Beijing is uncomfortable with this war, that it is very jarring for them to be put in this position, that they don't like this war, and that it's too radical for them. So we know that the Chinese Foreign Ministry has come out and taken a position that it is completely objective and impartial and wants to be a constructive part of bringing this conflict to an end and to de-escalation. So it seems that Moscow is getting a little bit more distance from Beijing in terms of the diplomatic speech coming out of Beijing. And we'll have to see if Beijing can become a more constructive peacemaker in this instance. That certainly would be very helpful from the vantage point